Hello and welcome back to Catching Up on Capitol Hill, a series in which we discuss the latest in tax legislation and in tax policy. I'm your host, John Gimigliano. Today we continue our discussion of the looming tax cliff of 2025. Last week we looked backwards to ask, how exactly did we get here? Well, today we turn our gaze to the future and we begin to consider how November's election could affect outcomes next year. We turn first to the tax plan of Republican nominee Donald Trump. And to do that today, I am joined by our friends Jennifer Gray and Tom Stout. You know, I'm asked almost every day if I've written materials on the Trump tax plan. And Jennifer and Tom, I'm sure you have had a similar experience because I have to explain to folks that it's not really that simple when we talk about the Trump plan. Listen, it's my job to follow both candidates and their every utterance on taxes. Yet when I'm asked about the Trump tax plan, well, honestly, I'm not entirely sure what it is. So today, let's unpack that. Let's get into why it's so hard to know the answer to what seems like a pretty straightforward question. So my first question for you, Jennifer, and honestly, I think it's time for a little truth telling with our audience. This episode was originally conceived as a summary of this week's debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, but obviously it's not about that. So Jennifer, let me ask you this question. Did we learn anything at all about taxes in the debate earlier this week?
Not really. We had some restating of items that had already been discussed by the candidates. Vice President Harris talked about her idea for allowing startup companies to deduct $50,000 of their startup expenses. She talked about the child tax credit expansion and first-time home buyers. But, there really wasn't an in-depth conversation of taxes. I felt like there was actually more tax discussion in the original Biden-Trump debate a few months ago.
Absolutely, I agree. They talked about it a surprising amount actually in that first debate. And that's why we kind of thought, oh, maybe taxes are really going to be a relevant topic in the debate, but they really weren't. I'm with you. We didn't learn anything new. So we made a quick pivot. That's okay. We don't have to talk about the debate. The debate was what the debate was. Let's instead now talk about the Trump tax plan. And that's what we're going to do today. So if you missed the debate, it's okay. Rest easy. You didn't miss anything new on taxes. So now what we're going to do is turn to the Trump tax plan such as it is, what we think we know. And Tom, I'm going to ask the first question to you. So we're going to run through a series of issues or ideas that may or may not be associated with the Trump plan. And the first one I have for you, Tom, is maybe the one we're most confident in is where do we think Trump stands on extending the expiring 2017 tax cuts?
Well, you're right, John. I mean, that is one area where his position is pretty clear. He's talked for years about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and it's probably his signature piece of legislation. So naturally, he's talking about extending all those individual cuts that are set to expire at the end of 2025. And in fact, it's sort of an area, at least of some agreement between Harris and Trump, because she's talked about extending the cuts for people who earn less than 400,000. So maybe even in a divided Congress, they could come up with something on it. The biggest barrier to it is the cost, which CBO is estimated to be $4 to $5 trillion over 10 years. That's going to be talked about more because we're in a situation now where debt being 100% of GDP this year, projected to go by CBO to 107% of GDP by 2029, even without extending these tax cuts. This would be piled on top of that. So that's going to be an issue they're going to have to deal with.
Absolutely. And we're going to talk about the Harris tax plan soon enough, and we'll get into the $400,000 pledge and what that means. But you're right. And the cost here is substantial. You said 4 to 5 billion. It's funny because I think you were both there when we were at a tax conference. I was introducing CBO director Phil Swagel, and I referred to those estimates as the CBO estimate. And he quickly corrected me that they were not his estimates, that they were the Joint Committee of Taxation's estimates, that $4 trillion for the actual cost of extending them. But then CBO layers on top of that, I think $600 billion interest cost if those were deficit financed. So that's how you get somewhere between 4 and 5 trillion on the cost of extending those. Jennifer, it's always so nice in our world to see things in writing. Has Trump said in writing, I support extending the 2017 tax cuts?
I would say sort of. If you go to his website and you click on platform, what he does is he links to the Republican Party platform as representing his 20 core promises to make America great again. And if you look at the Republican platform, it talks about making permanent the provisions of the Trump tax cuts that, quote, doubled the standard deduction, expanded the child tax credit, and spurred economic growth for all Americans. So I find it interesting. It does seem to almost limit it to some degree. It doesn't just come
Hmm.
out and say to make permanent the provisions of the TCJA. It does particularly point to those two items and then the sort of vague term of spurred economic growth for all Americans. So I think you could read into that a number of ways if one wanted to.
Yeah, Tom, what do you think? Are we reading too much into the fact that that is not an exhaustive list? Or do you think maybe they're leaving themselves some wiggle room on not extending everything?
As you say, there's really no plan, no detailed discussion of any of this. There's always the possibility that some of this drops out just as they add other things in. So, yeah, I wouldn't take any of this as the last word.
It's a really good observation, Jennifer, because we do have something in writing and it is linked to the campaign. So that's probably as solid a ground as we're going to be on as we go through the rest of this conversation on things that we're confident, relatively, that is part of the Trump tax plan. Got it. Okay. So, Jennifer, let me ask you about a different item. We heard, I think it was last week or the other week, there'd been rumblings that Trump supported a 20% corporate rate. Then there was word that he supported a 15% corporate rate. But then we got the most specificity in a speech that Trump gave around the corporate tax rate the other week. Can you remind us what he said? And then we can maybe talk about what that means.
As you mentioned, there have been press reports that perhaps in private meetings or conversations, he had indicated a support for lowering the corporate tax rate. And we do know that it was really, from what we understand, pressure coming from the White House that got the rate all the way down to 21% in the TCJA, because you know earlier Republican proposals had rates somewhat higher than that. But what he said in early September before the New York Economic Club, he made a speech, and one of the things he mentioned in that was implementing a corporate rate of 15% for American made goods, for whatever one might read into that and what that may or may not mean. Obviously, it's a very vague statement. In my mind, the first thing I thought was remembrances of the old Section 199 manufacturing deductions. So I'm not sure if something along those lines is what is being thought of, or if it's been that much thought out, or what exactly the thought is. But that's what he mentioned.
So just to be clear here, so it's not in writing, but it is on video. Do I have that
It
right,
is
Jennifer?
on video, correct? Yes, you can find it on YouTube.
Okay, so I'm going to leave it to you, listener, to determine whether or not we should call that part of the Trump tax plan or not. It's more than something that perhaps was said off the cuff at a random rally, because this clearly was a speech that was thought out and it was delivered for a specific audience. And it would appear that this idea was designed to be delivered to that audience. So, again, Jennifer, if I had to ask you, what is Trump's official position on the corporate tax rate? Would you be comfortable saying this is officially part of the Trump tax plan? Or is
I
this more in
would.
the maybe category?
I think I am comfortable saying that, as you mentioned, because of the venue in which it was discussed. As you said, it did not seem to be an off the cuff type conversation, which perhaps some of these earlier reports we heard may have been. This was before the New York Economic Club. It had quite a list of attendees there, including his former Treasury Secretary. So one would assume that this was a more thought out proposal.
Interesting. Okay. Okay. Well, there you go. We've got video. So we've gone from a website to video. Let's see what our next topic takes us. So this one's gotten a lot of press, Tom. The taxation of tips. Tell us what former President Trump has said about tips, what we think this idea might be.
Speaking of things that were addressed to a specific audience, this was is something Trump rolled out in a speech in Nevada, key electoral state. He threw out the idea of exempting tip income from tax. It surprise, another area of agreement. Harris quickly jumped on the same bandwagon since she also needs to win in Nevada. How seriously we should take this, who knows? I mean, immediately there was discussion about, well, what kind of loopholes is this creating? And it emerged for some Harris. Now, I guess the Trump campaign has picked up the idea that it would only apply to restaurant and hospitality workers. It wouldn't be available to, say, accountants who, might
Oh,
want to take their pay in chips. So too bad, John.
come
Um,
on, Tom. Throw me a bone
no,
here. Yeah.
no fun at all. But really no policy to support it. We don't have a cost estimate or anything like that. And it came as sort of from left field. But there it is out there. Whether either candidate would remain committed to it if elected remains to be seen.
Yeah, we had a lot of conversations about this thing. Like, what guardrails would you put on this? Oh, you can imagine this would be very, very expensive. not only because you think about the current quantity of tips in the economy, but of course, what the behavioral response would be,
Right.
I think, dramatic to this rule. So they'd have to put some guardrails on. You talked about some limit to service workers, and then you could even go further. You could have an absolute limitation on the amount of tips that would be excludable. Pick a number, 1,000, 10,000, whatever it is. You could have an income limitation. There's all sorts of ways that whether it's Harris or Trump can declare victory on exclusion of tips from income and still keep this a relatively small number. So people should not, as you sort of dampen my enthusiasm, Tom, I think other people should be prepared to have their enthusiasm dampened as to how big this might be.
Yeah. And there's the question of who would really get the benefit of this, whether owners of the establishments might reduce their regular pay to pick that up, which caused Harris to talk about increasing the minimum wage for tip workers. It becomes very complicated in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, well, as long as we're talking about pandering, Jennifer, how about this next one, which is the exclusion of Social Security income from taxation? Is there any particular demographic that Trump might have been pursuing with this proposal?
I can't imagine what that
Like,
would be. I would leave that up to the listener. But yes, he did indicate that he would like to exclude Social Security benefits from taxation. Currently, parts of those benefits are taxed for some recipients with incomes beginning at $25,000 and going up from that. And various percentages of the benefits can be taxed depending on income levels. But not to change the subject, but I'm going through Donald J. Trump's official Twitter feed, and he mentions in his official Twitter feed both the no tax on tips and he links to his speech at the New York Economic Club. So I think one can extrapolate from that both of those have been incorporated officially.
wow. So we've debated this long over the years since 2016. Is a tweet something that you can send out, as official position of a candidate or any official? And I think you're now saying whatever we're calling tweets now in the X
Yes,
world.
X,
Yes.
yes.
But are we saying that that's it, that that's enough now for us to incorporate this into the official tax plan?
As we said, I remember many discussions during the Trump presidency of can we refer to a tweet? How do we cite a tweet? And so I
I
think
know. We have so very little to go on here. So desperate times call for desperate measures. I'm prepared to say that a tweet is enough. So there we go. You're now prepared to say tips, Social Security, the corporate rate, all part of the official position. Got it. Okay. Let's move on to our next one. This is the most timely of all. Just what, a day, 2 days ago? Tom, we got a new position on the topic of overtime pay. Tell us what we heard about overtime pay.
Well, it's one more campaign pander. Trump rolled out yesterday that he would exempt overtime pay from tax. So what constitutes overtime pay? He didn't say. It's over 40 hours a week, over 8 hours a day. What about salaried employees who aren't hourly? I mean, who knows what this means? But this is one where we haven't heard Harris say anything yet. This one may be sort of a little too wild even for her to pick up, but we'll see. It's another, as you say, full pander for campaign purposes. So why not?
Yeah, and look, we're using the pander term very liberally here. Let's not kid ourselves. All right, that's what every candidate does. Take a look at Harris's. We'll talk about this when we talk about her plan, her proposals for the expanded child tax credit. All these tax cuts, some of which, many of which, most of which may never come to pass. That's kind of what it's all about. I get it. But it is interesting that we're getting these very novel ideas. And the one on overtime pay is truly novel. And I'm not 100% sure what the constituency is for this. We spent some time this morning talking about the behavioral response with tips. I'm not sure what the behavioral response is with this. How can people reconfigure their work arrangements to pile up on the overtime pay, which I'm sure, again, is something that we would be looking for. So I don't know. Do you think this is an expensive one? I think this is an expensive one, right, Tom?
It all depends on the guardrails that are put around it, and they haven't talked about any at this point. So
Right.
yeah, it could be pretty expensive. If you
Yeah.
don't put guardrails on it, then the mind reels at the ways it could be exploited.
You're right. It's probably the same kind of things we talked about with tips. There's an absolute excludable amount, cannot exceed a certain amount. Then after that, it's taxable, or there's an income limitation. There's phase ins, phase outs, all sorts of things that they can do to limit this. But this is the new one. Jennifer, that's the majority of ones that he's talked about specifically. You'll notice there was not a pillar 2 proposal, nothing on UTPR. We haven't gotten into the specifics like that. We're talking about these other items that are more focused on individuals, voters. But these are all expensive. We haven't talked about paying for anything yet. Tom started by saying that just extending the 2017 cuts alone was $4 trillion. And then we start to layer on top of that. So Do we have any indication from the campaign how we would pay for any of these items?
Not in the tax realm per se. When I started just off the top of my head thinking through the TCGA provisions that are expiring, that would be razors. The first one that came to mind was extending the salt cap, the limitation on the deductibility of state and local taxes. But that was the one that first came to mind. Looking at the campaign, most of the discussions have been in the area of trade and tariffs, across the board tariffs, particularly high tariffs on items coming in for China. But it's really been in that regard as opposed to through the tax code that we're hearing about ideas of offsets.
This did come up at the debate, right? Because Harris challenged him on it. I think she's calling it what his 20% sales tax or something, the tariff thing, saying you're basically imposing a 20% sales tax on. It's a very sort of crude analogy of what tariffs do, but that is an interesting point of view and one shared by many economists that the tariffs would be borne by consumers. But that is the thing that Trump has definitely talked about the most is using these tariffs to do a couple things, one of which is to raise revenue, one, impose the cost on China, debatable, and the other one is to encourage greater domestic manufacturing. One of the other ones, though, I mentioned that I recall from his speech at the Republican convention is he talked about ending the green scam. Now, I think that means repeal the Inflation Reduction Act. Would you take it to mean that, Jennifer? Is that a fair assumption?
At least in part, I think that would be a fair assumption. And it aligns with some of the proposals we've seen, particularly from House Republicans, as recently as some changes yesterday. So, yeah, I think that that would make some sense.
Yeah, again, I don't want to read too much into it, but I think that's a plausible interpretation of what we're talking about there. That won't get you near 4, 5, 6 trillion dollars, but it's not an insignificant amount that would be a potential pay for as well. And I think that is a future episode. I get that question so much. Are these Inflation Reduction Act credits in jeopardy? And there's lots of interesting nuances and ways to think about that. And that's probably a future episode as well. So there you go. Okay. So I have one last question, and this one's for you, Tom. But Jennifer, if you want to weigh in, you ought to. Why then do we think we have not gotten a more formal tax plan from Trump? Because we haven't exactly gotten a super formal plan from Harris, but we've definitely gotten things in writing from the Harris campaign. Why do you think Trump has been sort of more vague on taxes than we normally see from candidates?
A large part of the reason for that is talking about taxes can be campaign kryptonite if you're talking about increasing taxes or increasing the debt, which might trigger talk about how you would pay for it. If you avoid specifics, you avoid the difficult questions of things like offsetting the cost. I mean, we saw what happened when in 1988, one of the presidential candidates said he was going to raise taxes if he was elected. And of course, he wasn't elected. The one who was elected was defeated in 1992 because he said he wouldn't raise taxes and did. So, it's a difficult subject to address other than to say tax cuts for this group or that group or another group and just ignore the revenue cost, ignore what's happening to the debt and ignore everything else, not get into specifics. And there's no need to. You don't need to talk to specifics when you're on the campaign trail, talking to a general audience that doesn't really appreciate all of that anyway.
Jennifer, does that sound right to you that there's no real advantage of being more specific or putting anything in writing?
Potentially. And part of that might be this idea of with President Trump having been president before, that folks probably have a pretty general idea of what his positions would be. I was going through my files here as Tom was speaking, and we did have a little bit more in writing from Trump back in 2016 on taxes. So he has done it then. He did not, at least as far as my files had, have much in the way of written plan in 2020. So it might be the idea that, like 2020, that folks probably know where he's coming from with a lot of this, and so much of that focused on the TCJA.
Yeah, I think that's right. You could talk about them. Once you say no tax on tips, is there any advantage of fleshing that idea out more, putting in the guardrails? For now, let it be all things to all people. The guardrails can come later, but that's a nice problem to have. If you're the new administration, you have to figure out actually how to operationalize this idea. I think that's the right idea. All right, well, that's, I guess, it for the Trump tax plan. The problem, I guess, we're going to have, Tom and Jennifer, is we're getting things every week. So this episode is complete as we sit here on September 13th. But will it be correct next month? I don't know. We may have to come back and update this one, but very helpful. Thank you for your time today. In closing, let's just come back to that Trump proposal for a 15% corporate rate on domestic goods. As Jennifer said, it sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? Back in 2017, Congress repealed the old Section 199, the domestic manufacturing deduction, and used that revenue to help pay for the lower corporate tax rate overall. So then, do we think all this means that former President Trump is now second guessing himself on one of the more notable policy changes from his signature legislative accomplishment? Of course, we don't know. But let's dig in just a little deeper to see if we can get a better understanding of what this proposal might look like. The old domestic manufacturing deduction generally provided a 9% deduction against income derived from domestic manufacturing. This deduction, taken against the then 35% corporate rate, meant it was roughly equivalent to a 3% rate reduction against that income. But remember, if we simply reinstated that law today, it would be worth less against the now 21% corporate rate. If I'm doing my math right, it's roughly closer to a 2% benefit. So that doesn't really get us close to the 15% rate that Trump has called for. Now, of course, one way to deal with this would be to increase the deduction to more than 9%. Maybe something like 30%, I think, would get us close to 15%. But that's going to cost money, maybe a lot of money. So that raises the next question, is this even possible? So I went back and looked at the 2017 tax law. And back then in 2017, the Joint Committee of Taxation estimated that the repeal of Section 199 would raise about $98 billion. So the question then is, would reinstating that provision today cost $98 billion? Impossible for us to know. There are an endless number of variables to consider in revenue estimates. For example, the economy of 2025 will be substantially larger than the economy of 2017, so that should make it and everything else cost more. On the other hand, the corporate rate is lower, so as we said, the deduction could be less valuable. Also, we don't know whether the base of domestic manufacturing and production has increased or decreased since 2017. That affects the potential uptake of the new incentive. And we don't know how businesses would be expected to respond to this proposal. So let's just leave this really complicated question to the good people of the Joint Committee of Taxation and their talented revenue estimators to figure out for themselves. But I do have two final questions for you before we go. If not through reinstating the domestic manufacturing deduction, or not entirely, how else could we get the tax rate on that income to 15%? Well, if those domestic activities are also eligible for the current law, Foreign Derived Intangible Income, FDII benefit, well, wouldn't that help also? And perhaps given all the exact right facts, some domestic manufacturing income could get close to a 15% rate. Now, keep in mind, the FDII rate is scheduled to go up in 2025 as well. So Congress would probably have to do something about that at the same time. That too will cost money. But when you put all these pieces together, maybe it's not as far-fetched as you might have thought when it first appeared. Here's my last question for the day. Does any of this even make sense from a policy perspective? Well, maybe there is a certain coherence when you put this proposal up against the sweeping tariffs on imports that Trump has endorsed. If the larger goal here is to become less reliant on imported goods, then obviously we have to increase domestic production of goods, right? And one reason much U.S. manufacturing has left over the many decades is because goods can often be produced more cheaply elsewhere. So a lower tax on domestic goods coupled with a tariff regime could theoretically rebalance that calculus. Now, to be clear, before you send me the angry email, go ahead and take your fingers off the keyboard. I am not endorsing any of this. That's not what we do. But we did today talk a lot about political pandering, and to be sure, it does exist in elections. But usually, if you dig just a little deeper, there's some policy lurking there beneath the surface that is worth talking about. And that is what we do. And yes, we have so much more policy to talk about in the months to come. With that, thank you for tuning in to Catching Up on Capitol Hill today. We'll be back with you soon. And until then, take care.